All right, here we have our integumentary model. This is one of the Somso models. All the ones with green bases are Somso. They're usually the better ones that we have in here. They're kind of one of the top tier model companies. And I tend to like to use them if I can because their details are better and more accurate. With this, we are looking at the integument, and on this integumentary model, we are going to have two different regions of the integument. We're going to have thin skin on the left, so from here over, and thick skin on the right, this smaller third over there. So with our thin skin, we are going to have three, well, actually with skin in general, we are going to have two principal layers. We'll have the epidermis, which is very cellular because it's an epithelium. This is stratified squamous epithelium. And then we have the dermis, which is here. This is connective tissue, areolar, and then dense irregular connective tissue. And then underneath the integument, it's not really part of the integument, but it's always underneath the skin because this transitions us into whatever's below, whether it's muscle or bone or fat. This is going to be a layer of adipose-rich tissue called the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. It's not 100% adipocytes, but there are a lot of adipocytes, and it's pretty vascular. So this is where like subcutaneous shots go. So again, not technically part of the integument, but it's usually shown with all the integument models. Now, looking at our thin skin, we are going to have in the epidermis part of this, we're going to have four layers. So superficially, we have the stratum corneum. Deep to the stratum corneum, we have this layer that's just a little bit whiter on this model, but this is called the stratum granulosum, and then the stratum spinosum and the stratum basale. At the bottom or deepest part of the stratum basale is a basement membrane that divides the stratum basale from the underlying dermis, specifically the papillary layer, which is going to make up about a third of this kind of shallow portion of the dermis. And then the majority of the dermis is going to be dense irregular connective tissue, and it is the reticular layer. It gets its name not because it has reticular connective tissue, but it gets its name because a rete or reticulum is like a network, and the fibers inside here form this like very dense network of collagen that it resists tugging in many directions. So don't confuse that with reticular connective tissue. Now, back up to the epidermis. So the stratum corneum is dead cells, basically the carcasses of cells glued to the surface to help protect your body. So this gets sloughed off, no big deal, cell is already dead. The stratum granulosum are dying cells. You'll find some maturing keratohyalin inside there, so they're basically like helping to waterproof and glue themselves together, some lamellar granules. The stratum granulosum is incorporating melanin into the cells. It's also producing the proteins that will become keratin in the lamellar granules. These cells are alive, but they're getting pushed away from their nutrient source, so they're not alive for long. And then the stratum basale are happy, healthy cells that as long as they stay attached to the basement membrane, they will continue going through mitosis or dividing, and they push one daughter cell up and then one remains stuck. So that basement membrane is like the cue that says it's okay to continue mitosing. Now, when we look at thick skin over here, we have the same four layers plus one additional. So the superficial one is a very thick, is where thick skin really kind of shows its name, very thick stratum corneum. This can be up to hundreds if it's a real nasty kind of nasty or big, not bad nasty, but like big, strong callus. So that may have hundreds of layers of cells. Generally, this is going to be around 20 to 50 layers of cells and like not super calloused skin. Now, deep to the stratum corneum, we have a new layer, this yellow band. This is the stratum lucidum, and it is only present in thick skin. Then, deep to the stratum lucidum, you have the stratum granulosum, and deep to that is the stratum spinosum. The final layer, or deepest layer, just like on thin skin, is stratum basale, and this one you'll notice it has a lot more exaggerated curves up and down. So these are the downward protrusions are called epidermal ridges. The upward protrusions of the dermis are called dermal papilla, and they give the name of the next layer of the superficial layer of the dermis, which is the papillary layer of the dermis. That's where its name comes from. So these exaggerated dermal papilla and epidermal ridges give you a lot more contact area or surface area to essentially glue these layers together. So it makes that adhesion between the epidermis and dermis a lot stronger. You will also find in the dermal papilla, one of our sensory structures, a Meissner's touch corpuscle. They're pretty vascular, and you usually have quite a few eccrine sweat glands, or merocrine sweat glands is another name for these. These are the thermoregulatory ones, the ones that produce like a thin, watery or serous secretion. These are different than apocrine sweat glands, which is this yellow one. Now, normally these are going to exit, and I think they maybe just remove the hair follicle so we could see it better, but they're going to exit right at the base of a hair follicle. And this is an apocrine sweat gland. So this is our like stinky sweat that gets turned on during puberty. And this tends to be more lipid and protein rich. So bacteria just go to town on this. And when they metabolize those proteins and lipids, it produces the characteristic smell of body odor. Some cool tangents you can go down on like whether that's significant in an evolutionary sense. Probably plays a role in chemical attraction. But that's kind of not what we need to talk about now. So the apocrine sweat glands tend to be bigger, and they usually have a clear open lumen, whereas the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands, they tend to be smaller, and a lot of times you won't even see the lumen. You'll just see a bunch of cuboidal cells stacked up in here. And this is like a cross-section of an eccrine sweat gland, whereas here we're seeing the 3D view of it with those glandular pathways, those tubes still intact. So let's see, we have our epidermis, we have our papillary layer of the dermis. The majority of the dermis is the reticular layer of the dermis. Deep to that is the hypodermis. Our accessory structures of the skin are eccrine sweat glands, apocrine sweat glands, and what we haven't talked about yet are hair follicles, which have another gland in them called a sebaceous gland. That's what they look like in 3D. Here we can see a cross section. Notice that the epidermal cells actually kind of trace down into the hair follicle itself. So these are epidermal cells that are here. This is why a first-degree burn and a second-degree burn that kind of kill off a lot of this tissue, you can still regrow normal skin from that because these cells can migrate back out and essentially turn back into normal keratinocytes. Now, the sebaceous glands throughout most of your body are always associated with a hair follicle, and they release their kind of oil-rich, slightly acidic sebum onto this. It helps moisturize the hair follicle, and then it gets spread around the stratum corneum, helping to moisturize and waterproof it and keep you from getting infections because that acid mantle of the skin is slightly resistant to some of the fungi and bacteria we don't want to grow on us. Now, the hair follicle itself, we don't go into too much depth on these, but basically you have the inner root sheath, which is the epithelial cells, and then the outer root sheath, which is the connective tissue of the dermis, basically like a small layer of the papillary layer. You then have the hair itself. The shaft is above the skin. The root is the part of the hair that's below it. Here at the base, we have our hair matrix and the bulb of the papilla, which is where it gets its blood supply. So this is a little bit of connective tissue that gets close to these dividing epithelial cells. And hair is just modified keratinocytes, so they're basically the same as what you have up here. And these nutrients keep them happy and dividing and pushing that hair up and out. You will have, and I don't see it on this model, but you will also have a nerve that wraps around the base of the hair follicle called the hair root plexus. And that allows you for a great deal of sensitivity, so that if like a mosquito or tick is walking along here and it just taps this hair shaft, you can detect that really easily, whereas that tick might be too light to stimulate touch receptors in the papillary layer or Merkel cells in the epidermal layer there. So with our hair follicle, we have our sebaceous gland, our hair follicle itself, we have the bulb down here, we have the hair root papilla with our nutrients coming in, and we also have an erector pilli muscle. This is smooth muscle, and when this contracts, it's what gives us goosebumps. Now, it's not really important for humans from a adaptive advantage anymore. It's thought that a lot of the reason we still have body hair is because of that parasite detection, allowing us to know when something's crawling across us, because it definitely doesn't help us with thermoregulation. It doesn't help us with like threat displays, like when a cat puffs up. So this is really something that is main function is probably sensory in origin, or why we still have them, I should say. I think the last structure on here that I haven't talked about is this big green guy over here. This is a lamellated or Pacinian corpuscle. Like the Meissner's touch corpuscle, it is going to assist with sensation. Meissner's corpuscles are important for fine and discriminant touch along with Merkel discs. Lamellated corpuscles, these are more for like deep pressure sensations. And so like when you feel general, like I'm sitting so I can tell the pressure on my thigh as it presses against the chair, it's these pressure receptors that are particularly important with that. Histologically, to me, they've always looked like you cut an onion in half. So they're layered like this with that nerve fiber protected in the center. We will also have free nerve endings, and I don't really see any of those on this model, but those are going to help with like nociception and thermoreception inside the dermis as well. So hopefully that helps you out with this model, and I will keep making these for the other models.